Katie. I'm a marine interpreter here at the New Zealand Marine Studies Centre, and today we're going to be walking through Activity 2B down at the rocky shore. So an interesting thing to think about when we're in an environment like the rocky shore is the gradients of temperature that you're going to come across throughout the day, and also from the high shore down to the low shore. So right now the tide is right out, as we can see, and that leaves some of the area of the beach quite exposed, not just to the air, but also to the sun, right? So if we take a wee look down here at our rock pool, we can see we've got quite a small amount of water that is being heated up by the sun over time. So if you're an animal living in one of these rock pools, you're going to have to be quite tolerant to these changes in temperature. We've got a couple cool wee creatures in here. So there's a wee top shell snail hanging out in some of this water. We've got a few blue feather worms, even a couple of snakeskin chitons, which are my faves because you can see that they have this little banding around them that looks kind of like a snake's skin. One other thing that we need to consider when we think about variables that will change along the rocky shore environment, especially in these wee rock pools that are so exposed during this low tide time, is salinity. So our normal ocean is usually about 35 parts per thousand salt. When we talk about salinity, we're talking about the content of salt in the water. So if you have a litre bottle of milk, you'll have 35 grams of salt in that litre bottle of milk. What happens when these tide pools get exposed over this long gradient of the day, for that several hour period, is that the sun beats down on this water, and as you can probably guess, some of that water starts to evaporate off, and you get an increase in salinity. Also sometimes though, you'll have days where the weather is not like this, and it's really rainy. Then as you got that fresh water beating down in these tide pools, that salinity will decrease. So the animals living in here need to be tolerant to a whole range of salinity much further outside of that of the harbour or the open ocean. So one thing that you'll need to think about when you're thinking about these processes of cellular respiration and photosynthesis is that they are having different inputs and outputs to the system. So photosynthesis takes up CO2, so that'll reduce the carbonic acid within your water column as they produce O2 as a byproduct. And then your cellular respiration will be producing CO2 as a byproduct, and that will interact with the water to form carbonic acid, which therefore decreases your pH level, increasing the acidity of the water column. So here we're going to compare the physical conditions of a rock pool with the ocean. So like we talked about before, our rock pool, especially on a day like today, is going to be a little bit warmer when your tide is out. Whereas your ocean may be a bit cooler and also just more of a stable temperature because you've got so much more water that you're dealing with. Another thing to consider will be the salinity, right? So in our rock pool on a day like today, it was a little bit more saline because you've got that evaporation occurring and the sun beating down in that rock pool. In our ocean environment, it might be a little less saline because we've got so much more water, so it's less affected by that evaporation from the sun. But also on a different type of day, on a really rainy day, you might find that your rock pool is a lot more fresh. So now we're going to think about the inputs and outputs in our rocky shore system and what our species need to survive for these inputs, and then what their outputs are as a result of these processes that they do to survive. So our photosynthesizing organisms like our kelps and our seaweeds and even some of our aquatic plants, they require sunlight and CO2 and certain types of nutrients to survive. Once they've done their photosynthesizing and respiring, they will produce waste products as an output. So when we think about the species that we have on our rocky shore, we also obviously need to think about our animals, right? So unlike our photosynthesizers, animals are respirers and they use food to get their energy. So here I've got a wee spiny sea star. So spiny sea stars are predators. They live across the rocky shore environment and they take advantage of the different animals along this rocky shore to help create energy for them and help them survive. So they need the inputs of food, they need inputs of oxygen to help them respire, and then they will produce CO2 as a byproduct of that respiration, and they'll produce waste products as an output of that respiration as well as of that feeding of all the little animals on the rocky shore. So under this rock here we have a wee half crab. So crabs are really diverse in the way that they consume food and the way that they live life, depending on where they live in the marine realm and what species they are. Our wee half crabs are pretty cool. They're actually filter feeders, so they will filter on any kind of particulate organisms in the water column, and they use this with these two wee, I like to call them fishing nets, adaptations that they use to bring in phytoplankton and zooplankton in the water column to eat. So inputs for these guys will be food in the form of particulates in the water column, so your zooplankton and your phytoplankton. Their outputs will be waste, and like all other heterotrophic marine organisms, they will need to consume oxygen and produce CO2 as a byproduct of that waste. So today we had a think about some of these physical parameters acting on our intertidal zone, and we had to think about some of these biological processes occurring inside our rock pools, as well as the changing parameters within them. Hopefully this places a little bit of your experiments into context, and also you're able to think about how these natural variations in pH occur in our intertidal environment.